Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Big Questions, Small Steps. My name is Amanda and I'm glad that you could join me today. This episode is a special request video. It actually comes from my amazing boyfriend who wanted to know more about when I was a confirmation teacher and I took the class that I had on worship visits. So our goal in all of that was to really just kind of open their eyes to other experiences that they may choose to worship in. So we plan typically for 5 visits within a year, and the visits changed depending on our experiences and the availability of different places and things like that. But because our church was a Christian church and it was part of what's called the United Church of Christ, we always made sure that at least one of the visits was to United Church of Christ church, but a service that was slightly different than ours. So we are in Wisconsin. We're in a small town, but by congregation size, we're on the larger side of a worship experience in a UCC. So we tried to go to a spot that had a very small congregation or one that had a very large congregation. But just so you can have a little bit more of an understanding of what experience they were coming from, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the church that I was a part of, the United Church of Christ. Because the purpose of the worship visits was to help them see similarities and differences in ways that people practice and worship God. And then also I wanted them to get comfortable in the idea of going different places and being okay with the idea that they may feel most connected to God in a place that's not a UCC church. I wanted them to know that that was okay. And as a matter of fact, that was absolutely fine and God would still love them. So I wanted them to have that experience. So the church that I was part of was United Church of Christ. It was very traditional in operation, but the United Church of Christ, or UCC as they're frequently referred to, is very inclusive, very open. They are one of the first denominations that made a movement to have multiple of their churches be what they call open and affirming. So they welcomed people who happen to be gay or transsexual or things like that. They were one of the first groups to do interfaith, intersex marriages, that's just what they were. They're known as an open and affirming group. They have pastors who may or may not be openly gay, and that's absolutely fine with them. They don't have any questions or concerns with that. Now, the church that I was a part of, before it was United Church of Christ, it was Evangelical Reform, and before it was Evangelical Reform, it was the German Reform, and before the German Reform, it was just the German church. So Germans tend to be very stubborn. Don't know if you know that, but they tend to be stubborn and kind of hold on to their traditions and their ways and practices. So my church is no different than that. The United Church of Christ that I was a part of was very big on traditions, and the traditions weren't necessarily built around or about the Bible or Jesus or God. It was just things that they did because they've always done them. So, for example, there were 2 things that I can think of off the top of my head that occurred every year during Advent. So, Advent in the Christian church is that period of time before Christmas. It's a time of preparation. So 2 things that happened. One was, so our church, the Christian church, always was decorated to the nines. Always had beautiful things hanging up and decorations. So during Advent, there would be a Christmas tree within the sanctuary, and on that Christmas tree was a little glass pickle I know, sounds kind of weird, but there's a thing, it's called The Legend of the Pickle, and basically it's meant to remind you or encourage you to look for great things in unusual places or unexpected places. So tradition has it that if you find the pickle, you either get to open the first gift or you get a special gift. So that's one of the traditions. The other tradition that the church that I was a part of did every year without fail is something they did with the children in Sunday school. It's called What's in the Box. And it basically was a way to encourage them to understand the concept of waiting and anticipation that Advent brings. So every year there would be a box, and it was rather large, and it was wrapped. And inside the box, the kids were told is a present for them. And every week they had the opportunity to guess what was inside. However, there were different things that they could do every week to get a little bit closer to the idea of what might actually be in there. So the first week, for example, they could just look at it. They couldn't do anything else but look at it. The second week, they could hold it. Again, couldn't do anything else, but they could hold it. So they would have the different experiences, and then the kids would guess every week. And you know, kids are kids, so they have random guesses. Oh, it's a candy cane. Oh, it's a puppy dog. Oh, it's a remote control car. And when we tell them that there was one for all of them inside this box, they still didn't quite get it. So the guesses were very amusing for the congregation that was watching it all. The kids just looked forward to getting the gift. So that's just two traditions that the United Church of Christ did. The church in particular that I was a part of at the time. They viewed tradition to be very important, family to be very important. So when we went on worship visits, we were looking at how different worship experiences were. Were they similar? Were they different? Did they feel more at home in different places? So typically the first visit that we went on would be another United Church of Christ. And like I said, it typically was one that was smaller or one that was much larger. So we went to a United Church of Christ up in, it was like in the Appleton, Green Bay area. And it was quite large, and there were people all over, and there was a choir, but it was like a professional choir. It was a college group that came in and sang. It just seemed very much like a performance, and it seemed not quite as genuine in my experience. The smaller churches that we were visiting for the United Church of Christ were very similar to our church. They were mostly farmers or people who lived in the country, and everybody did everything for that church, and all hands on deck kind of feel. But there wasn't a lot of encouragement to know, grow, do more. They took what was there, and they appreciated what was there, and they made do with what was there. And that worked for them. So the kids enjoyed that experience. That was their first step outside of the United Church of Christ that we were a part of. And that was always an interesting one, because there would inevitably be kids in confirmation that had never been outside of the church that we were a part of. Or maybe they just went to their grandparents' church and they've never been to anywhere else. So it was always interesting to hear their feedback on things that they liked, things that they didn't like. I remember one group we took to a small rural church, and they had, I believe they called them blessing bears, that essentially were little stuffed animals that were in the pews, and there would be little notes attached to them, and the worshipers were actually encouraged to take that item with them and give them to somebody else. And on the little tag, it said, this this bear was blessed for you by the members of this church, and we hope you find happiness, and may you know that you are loved always. So a great thing. The kids really liked that idea. They loved that personal connection. So after we went to the UCC church, we would go to one of many different worship visits. So I'm going to kind of run down a majority of the worship visits that we went on. I'm not going to go through them all because that would easily be a multi-hour long presentation. And I'll just be honest, I don't think you want to listen to me for that long. So let's get started. The first visit that I want to tell you about is the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church was an interesting one because out of all the worship experiences that we've had, out of all the places we've contacted, because we always contact them before we show up, because we can be rather intimidating to have 15 random people show up and want to ask questions afterwards. So I reached out to a couple of Catholic churches, and we were told, no, please don't come here, by not one, but two. And that was surprising to me. Coming from a United Church of Christ where they're all about inclusivity and yes, the more the merrier, you're welcome, blah, blah. I was not expecting to be turned down, let alone twice. And the reasons we were turned down is we were told we would be a distraction to the other worshipers with our mere presence. And we were also told that we didn't belong there because we were not Catholic. And this was not a sideshow spectacle thing. So I felt very excluded and very, very much looked down upon. So we found a Catholic church that was willing for us to come, and they were wonderful and warm and welcoming. But as always, we do our research about the religion before we go. And then we have our experience and we do a debriefing afterwards with either a pastor or a reverend or a president or somebody who knows something about that community. So we went to the Catholic Church, and it was interesting. So in our research, I should note that so they view themselves as the one true church. So not necessarily that they have an ego about them, but they come across as kind of having a chip on their shoulder because they view themselves at a different level than everybody else. They view themselves as having the closest relationship to God, and everybody else is kind of missing the mark and is second class. They view the Pope. The Pope is the head of their church, and there's a hierarchy. So the Pope, what the Pope says, his interpretation of the Bible, that's on the same level as God to Catholics. They view whatever the Pope says as the same as the Bible. So if the Pope, for example, says, no, you're not supposed to eat meat on Fridays, only fish on Fridays during Lent, then that's why they do it. And that's still true to this day. The Pope made that proclamation, if you want to call it that, not because it said so in the Bible, but because he was trying to give the citizens a break or a reason to not feel bad about providing meat for their families on Fridays when it was almost a famine time. So he was trying to help his people. But the fact that they still do it to this day and it's not part of the Bible, it's from a pope, that's the difference. And so that's one of the things that Catholicism or Catholics do. Another aspect is that Catholics do not view salvation or being saved as through Jesus. They view that they're going to be saved or get to heaven through the acts of the church. So through taking communion, through confessional, through saying prayers. They believe that when you die, you can have family members even do things on your behalf to help you get to heaven. So that's a big difference. It's not about you or your belief. It's about what you're doing for the church or in the church, those actions. Now, when we went to a Catholic service, I can tell you a little bit more about that because I happened to teach at a Catholic school for a year. So being a part of a Mass was rather commonplace for me. So when you walk into a Catholic service, next to the door, you will have a bowl full of water, and that's holy water. When you walk in, you're supposed to dip your fingers into the water and make the sign of the cross on you. That's essentially purifying yourself and bringing Christ close to you, bringing that physical connection to you. Okay, so that's the first thing you do, and then you walk down an aisle, and before you sit in the pews, you do a little bow with a knee. It's called genuflecting. It's to show respect for God and for Jesus, that you recognize that they are higher than you and you are lower than them. So you bow out of respect, and then you go and sit. Now, in the church sanctuary or worship space, you will see tons of artifacts. There will be stained glass windows. There will be statues. There will be all kinds of stuff everywhere. In every single Catholic church that I have ever been to, it is immaculately decorated. And for each of the seasons of the church, they change that up as well. There's always a cross present. There is decorations. Gold tends to be a preferred color in Catholic sanctuaries, but it's beautifully and ornately decorated. So that's what it looks like. Over on the side, typically, you'll see like a room with 2 doors, sometimes 3 doors, and it's all closed off. That's typically where the Catholics would do confessional. So the priest would sit in the middle room, and then people will go on either side at different times, and he'll hear them confess what they did wrong, and he'll say, oh, you have to do this many Hail Marys, which is a prayer, or whatever they need to do to purify that sin or get rid of that sin. So that's what they'll do. Another thing that the Catholics will sometimes bring with them to service is, it looks like a necklace. It's not a necklace. It's a big circle, and then there's a cross. That's called a rosary. And the Catholics use that rosary to say a prayer. Every bead on that necklace is a different prayer. Whether it's the Lord's Prayer or the Hail Mary, or there's a whole bunch of different ones. But they're very much about tradition, and they do things because that's what they do. Tradition is huge for Catholics. So they have that. Now, so I talked about all the decorations and everything. When the priest comes in, so it's typically a priest, or sometimes he'll go by a father. Sometimes he'll be a monk and he'll wear a robe. But it's always a male, and they are always leader. So they will, when they come in, they have like a stick with a ball on it. And inside the ball is incense that when they're walking, they'll kind of wave it all over. And that's to remind you that there's a Holy Spirit, or there's a holiness about this place that they're in, and to kind of purify the space so you're ready to receive God and Jesus. They believed God and Jesus is physically present in that space during worship. The priest will also come in with 1 to 2 kids. They're either called altar boys or altar girls. And they're basically like the priest's helpers. They hold things for him. They get things ready. They help serve the elements and things like that during service. So priest comes in, the service begins. Now, the service is typically in English. There are many communities, however, where the service is in Spanish because that's their population. But there will also be portions that are in Latin because that's just what they do. Now, as the service goes along, There will be times that you will see the congregation standing, the congregation sitting, the congregation kneeling. So in the pews where you're sitting, there's a little bench type thing that will fall down, and that's your kneeler. So in Catholicism, they stand if they are speaking what they believe to be the actual word of God. So there are portions of the scriptures when they're reading them that they will stand for. And they will flip the kneeler down, particularly after a certain prayer. They'll flip the kneeler down. It's basically more of a reflection time, individual time on the kneeler. However, I did notice most people go to the kneeler after communion. Now, interesting thing about communion. When you are Catholic, you are taught how to receive the elements of communion, so bread and wine. And you are taught how to hold your hands to receive the elements. If you are not Catholic and you try to go up to receive the elements for communion, because they have communion at every single Mass, if you do not hold your hands the correct way or say the correct things to the priest, they will know you're not Catholic and you will not be eligible to receive the elements. That's just how they do it. So you will receive a blessing, but you will not receive the elements. So after you go up for communion, then you go back to your pew and you kneel. And that's a time where you're supposed to do quiet prayer, kind of just talking to God. There's certainly songs. They have hymnals or songbooks that they sing out of. And the rest of the service is pretty consistent or comparable to what we would have experienced at a United Church of Christ church. Communion was a big difference. The kneeling was a big difference. And just the ornateness of everything. Typically, people didn't necessarily look at us like we were heathens or we were looked down upon, things like that. But there was definitely some side eyes if you did not do the moves at the correct time. But if you know how to play follow the leader, you can typically get by in a Catholic church absolutely fine. If the people in front of you stand, then you stand. If the people behind you sit, then you sit type thing. Just do what everybody else does and you'll get by and you'll be fine. So that was our trip to the Catholic Church. It was interesting, to say the least. It was not one that any of the kids despised. It was not one that the kids didn't like. It was very interesting to watch the kids see other people from their school sometimes. And they would be like, oh, I didn't know you were Catholic. And then they would kind of look at them like, oh, you're not Catholic, and kind of not shame them, but look down on them a little bit. Okay, so the next one that we're going to talk about is actually my personal favorite, and that is when we went to visit the Jewish synagogues. So there were two different synagogues that we visited. One was smaller. It's actually the synagogue that I currently attend. And one was in a larger city called Appleton. Both of the synagogues happen to be of the conservative movement. So if you recall, in Wisconsin, where I live, there are three main movements of Judaism. There's Reform, there is Conservative, and there is Orthodox. So conservative is kind of, to put it in simple terms, it's kind of like the middle of the road of the three movements. So I'm going to tell you more about the large synagogue that we attended because I've already told you a little bit about the smaller synagogue where I currently attend. Okay? Sounds good. So the first thing you need to know is whenever you go to a synagogue, there is almost all of the time going to be security officers present. And that was a bit off-putting. That was the first experience that the students in the confirmation class, had to see security officers at a worship space. It kind of took them back a little bit. They weren't quite sure what to attribute that to. So the rabbi actually had to talk to them and share that there is so much anti-Semitism in the world that to advertise that this is a synagogue or a place where Jewish people meet, that just invites people who have ill intentions or ill will towards people to come and cause problems. So synagogues in general typically don't have a lot of signage saying that they are a synagogue, or hey, we have service tonight at this time, or things like that. You will have a notation of what the building is, but it's not going to be a bright shiny light. That's just not what they do. So they have security officers to ensure that the people who are coming there to worship are safe, because unfortunately there's a lot of anti-Semitism. So when we went to the larger synagogue, I'm not gonna lie, it was kind of sketchy looking at first. So we did not go in through the front door because of the synagogue and that we were bringing a larger group. We came through a side door. So when we walked in, there was not much lighting. There was a side door. You didn't really know what was going on, why you were there. But you walk into the building and you're immediately struck with knowledge. Now, not necessarily that they're teaching you right away, but everywhere you look, on every single room, there are bookshelves full of books, like huge reference books. And you're just automatically in awe and taking all this in. It's not the same book. It's not like you have a whole wall full of, oh, this is the Jewish Bible. Oh, no, this is all dictionaries. No, they're all different books. But just the sheer look of it all strikes you with, holy cow, these people know stuff. And it's a bit shocking to see that much. So as we were walking in, the rabbi is the leader of a Jewish synagogue, and he happened to be talking to us and sharing a little bit about like the history of the synagogue, things like that. As we're walking towards the sanctuary space, we pass a kitchen. And now when we attended, it was a Friday night, and I was rather surprised that there were people in the kitchen. And I thought, oh, are you doing like something special just because we're here? And he had to share that no, as a matter of fact, they weren't doing something special just because we were there. He explained that when Friday night service starts, it's the start of Shabbat. For that particular service it was. And during Shabbat, depending on your observance level, people don't cook or they won't turn on lights or things like that. So in the Jewish community, at the synagogue, they tend to observe on a very high level so that regardless of what level of observance anyone in that congregation is, they will feel comfortable in order to participate. So they had caterers hired to come and prepare the food and serve it and then clean up afterwards. I thought that was a pretty cool thing. I wasn't expecting it by any means. And quite honestly, I thought it was a little bit of an overkill. Like, really, we can't just clean up our own dishes. I didn't understand, but it was a new concept to me. I never had experienced that before. So after we did that, we went into the synagogue space. So the synagogue space where the worship is, the sanctuary, if you want to call it that, it was very different than the Catholic space. So the Catholic space was very ornately decorated. The Jewish space was not. It was very simplistic, and anything that was there served multiple purposes. So there were some stained glass windows, there were stars in them, there were some horn-like things, there were menorahs in it, and then there was this kind of looked like a closet with a cover over it. And the rabbi explained that that was what they call the Ark. That's where they hold the Torah scrolls and different different sanctuaries, different synagogues may have one, they may have many, because Torahs are extremely expensive, and they are well protected and well cared for because they believe it is the word of God, and they only bring it out even during services unless there's a certain number of people present. So it's called a minyan, and it's typically 10 people that have to be there in order to take the Torah out. So that's the worship space. Now, the interesting thing about a Jewish worship space that's different than any other worship space that we visited was it wasn't pews and it wasn't folding chairs. It was like theater chairs, like the cushy kind with the fold down seats, and they had armrests. So it was a little bit more leisurely in that regard. Now, come to find out through service that it's typically that way because the Jewish services are longer than Christian services typically. Jewish service lasted about 1.5 hours, and that's just how it went. So when the service was starting, we noticed, or the rabbi was explaining, that people who are coming to service in a Jewish synagogue will wear different things. So the ladies didn't have to, but some of them wore, it kind of looked like a paper doily on their head. And men tend to wear this little circle hat called a yarmulke, or it's a hat, it's bigger than a yarmulke, and it's called a kippah. And those are two things that people wear. Well, the yarmulke and kippah are typically worn by men, and then the doily was worn by female, but a woman could wear a kippah or a yarmulke if they wanted. They just didn't at this synagogue. Those were worn traditionally by Jewish people during service to remind them that God is above them and to kind of humble them to receive the word of God. So that's what they wore on their head. Now, men, I noted, were wearing this long, it kind of looked like a scarf / shawl. It was called a talit, and it's long, and I was watching one of the gentlemen put it on. So there on the back where the neck is, there's this like plaque, for a lack of words, that has Hebrew letters on it, and it's a prayer. I'm not quite sure what the prayer is, and quite honestly, I don't know if the prayer is the same on every talit, but it's something, and they kiss that, and then they wrap the whole thing around themselves, and they say another prayer, and then they'll place the talit on their shoulders and kind of around them. Now, some people wear it where it kind of wraps around their arms. Some people wear it where it just goes around their neck and hangs down. Some people have long ones where it would go down to like their wrist, so they'll actually take the bottom and flip it up to make like a short sleeve version. But that's the talit. The talit the men wear to remind themselves that they are covered in God's love and just kind of protect them and keep them in God's presence. It's a beautiful thing. Some of them are gorgeous, but I didn't wear one because I'm not a man. So that's what they were wearing, and then service began. Now, what you should know about a Jewish service is it's in Hebrew. You're not going to understand most of what's going on. Now, there was a couple of books that were out by the chairs that we were sitting in. One was called the Siddur. It's kind of like the worship service, and they would randomly tell us what pages we were on. And that book does not go left to right like a normal book. It goes right to left. So you read it backwards, and all the sentences are backwards as well. It is written in Hebrew as well as English, and sometimes you'll get a transliteration. So transliteration is basically the Hebrew way to say things in English letters. So it gives you a little bit of a step up. Did I understand anything that they were saying? No, not at all. There is not an organ or a piano or anything like that typically in a Jewish service. Now, we were at conservative services. There are instruments sometimes at Reform movement services. But again, we were at a conservative movement, so there was no piano, no organ, no nothing like that. They did sing/chant, and again, that was in Hebrew, and I didn't understand it. But their chants are rather catchy. You can catch on to them rather easily, and they tend to sing it multiple times. So again, that helps. So there was lots of chanting, there was lots of prayers. There would be times they would stand, times that they would sit. When they brought the Torah out of the ark, it was in scrolls, and the rabbi showed us the scrolls are actually made not of paper but of parchment. And he explained, that because they're made out of parchment, oils on people's hands can be quite damaging to them. So they use a special pointer finger, like it's on a stick, so they don't put their oils on the Torah. And when they bring the Torah out, they actually circled around the congregation, and people would take their talit and they would take the strings or the cloth and they would touch the Torah and then they would kiss it, and basically showing their love or their appreciation for Torah. Then when it came up to the altar area, or they call it the bima, they would put the Torah scrolls on there and then they would unroll it. There was only certain people called up to the Torah to see it or hear it and do blessings and all that stuff. But it was pretty neat. It was pretty neat. The rabbi was very informative and gave us lots of great information as to what was going on and why it was going on. It was neat. Again, it was one of my favorites, as you can probably tell, because I'm on the journey of converting to that. Once it was finished, once the service was finished, we moved into the next room where we had what they call Kiddush. And it was basically a time of just connecting with community, because in the Jewish faith, community is very important. They're all about having a personal relationship with God, but they also see the community as very important to strengthen your personal relationship with God. So that was the Jewish service. It was long. The kids were very interested. The kids were very attentive, even though they didn't understand what was going on, because it was in a different language. We did go to another service that did not speak English, and that was actually an Islamic service. So the kids, when we went there, it was shortly after 9/11, and there was some trepidation about going there and realizing that we have an Islamic mosque quite close to us, as a matter of fact. They were completely unaware that that was possible, that happened, but they were interested in going. Again, families had to be reassured that there were safeguards in place for everything, because there were biases and there was ill thoughts towards people of the Muslim culture, Islamic culture, because of 9/11. So we did our due diligence there and helped break some barriers and helped strengthen some understandings. So when we went there, the first thing we noticed was, holy cow, there's a lot of kids around here. Having big families is important in Islam. So there were children everywhere. The second thing that the students noted was the dress was different. So when we walked in, we walked upstairs and we immediately had to take our shoes off. You could not wear your shoes into the worship space. We went into the worship space early, and we were talking and getting some bearings down together. And there were women there, and they were they were dressed differently than in a Christian service. All of them were dressed differently than in a Christian service. Some of them wore, I believe they're called burqas, where they're covered from head to toe and you can only see their eyes. And some of the eyes you could see through, and some of them kind of had like a mesh covering over them. Some of the people wore a headscarf and just a dress. Some of the people wore pants underneath a dress, but they were all fully covered. Their hair was covered, their neck was covered. They didn't typically have makeup on, and they were covered from their face all the way down to their ankles. Their hands could be exposed, but they had to have securing fasteners at the wrist so that their arm would not be exposed. And they all wore socks because they had their shoes off for prayer. So that was something that we noticed right away. Men typically wore pants and a shirt. They didn't have to necessarily worry as much about covering. And there wasn't any necessarily specific garb that the men wore. Some of the men did wear like a hat that looked similar to a kippah. So it wasn't small, it covered more of their head, but it wasn't like a beanie or a baseball hat or something like that. Some of them, not all of them. So that's what we noted about the people. Now, when we came in, we were all together, but then as the service started, the men went on one side and the women went on the other side, and there was like an accordion folding wall in between. The speaker was a male, so the speaker was on the men's side. Women could listen, they couldn't see. All of the people sat facing a certain direction, knowing what we knew about Islam. They are facing Mecca, so it's all about a geographical location, and that's where you always have to pray to. So they weren't facing forward, they were kind of on an angle, is where the group that we were at were praying. And they typically sat straight on the floor. There were no chairs. It was a carpeted space. They sat straight on the floor, and during their service, they spoke Arabic. There was not a lick of English in there. So it was straight Arabic, and we didn't understand what was going on. We couldn't even necessarily tell when it was praying, when it was like a chanting, or when it was like a sermon type thing. You really couldn't tell a whole bunch. Now, there was a point in time in the service where the ladies, they stood up and then they took a bow, and they stood up and then they like touched the ground and like laid on the ground. It was different movements, and all the ladies that were there happened to be refugees who were rather new to America. So their English was not the strongest, and I'm not quite certain if they didn't understand what we were asking, if they didn't know how to explain it, or if they didn't quite honestly want to talk to us. I'm not quite certain. But when we asked about what they were doing, why, like to help us understand the prayer, they couldn't really or didn't really answer us for that. So after service was done, we joined together and we asked the leader a couple more questions. That's when I noticed that there is definitely a hierarchy of genders in Islam. There was myself and there was another guide, instructor, whatever you want to call him, that happened to be male. And the speaker that we were speaking to got a little miffed when I continued to ask different questions. It almost seemed like he was getting agitated, like I was questioning or belittling him. And that wasn't my intention by any means. I was asking questions to understand more. He would take the same question that I asked from the male counterpart to me, and he would answer the question just fine. I think he didn't like the fact that a female was questioning a male. When there were males and females that were both Islamic in the same space, or both Muslim in the same space, the male would be the one to answer all the questions. The female would take care of the kids or just not talk. That was our experience with that. Service was nice. They were very, very nice people, very welcoming people, but they did not like when you asked questions. They didn't like it. They wanted to just be known and accepted. Now, the one cool thing that I learned from our questioning is they shared that they have like a loudspeaker where they will broadcast this sound or this chant about 5 times a day. And at first I was thinking 5 times a day, that's quite a lot to pray. But I loved the way he explained it. He explained, that they pray 5 times a day because they realize that in every situation throughout the day, they're going to fall short of their very best. So it's kind of like a reset time. Maybe I was frustrated because the cashier was rude to me. Maybe I was frustrated and I was snippy with somebody on the phone because they interrupted me. Maybe I ate something that I wasn't supposed to. Whatever it happens to be, they pray 5 times a day to recognize and realize and kind of bring more awareness to the fact that they're missing the mark. And I thought that was a really awesome point of view. I loved that idea. Now I can tell you with full confidence, there was not a single person who came away from the visits to the Islamic mosque and said, "Ooh, yes, I think that's where I want to be." There were a lot of people who came away with a lot of questions and a lot of good discussions that happened with families afterwards, but that was not necessarily one that the kids loved, but definitely was great to open their eyes. So that was a super, super neat experience and one that they didn't anticipate. Very cool. So the next one that we're going to talk about is one that families and the kids in particular were quite apprehensive about going to. And that's when we visited a Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall. I know. So Jehovah's Witnesses, if you don't have any experience with them, typically they are known for wearing, the females wear dresses all the time or skirts all the time. And they are the group of people who tend to come around to people's houses and want to talk to you about Jesus and your connection. Not necessarily Jesus, sorry. They call it Jehovah, and they're talking about God. And they want to save you. They want to help you learn more so you can be saved. So there was apprehension when we scheduled the visit, but the people were very welcoming. So let me tell you a little bit about what our research showed about Jehovah's Witnesses so we knew what we were walking into. So Jehovah's Witnesses are part of the Christian denominations because they believe in one God. There's one God. They believe that Jesus was there, and they believe that Jesus was God's son, but he's like a lesser God. They don't worship or praise Jesus by any means. They believe that Jesus did rise from the dead, but he didn't rise physically. He rose spiritually. So that's a big difference. Another difference that they had is they believe that there's a second coming, that whether it's Jesus or another Messiah, they're coming again, and they're coming soon. They don't necessarily know the exact date, but they know that when the second coming happens, a certain amount of people, they actually have a number. They believe that 144,000 people of the chosen people will be raised to heaven. And they call themselves the witnesses. They believe that it's the witnesses that will rise to heaven. Now, if there's only 144,000 spots, you may wonder, well, why are they trying to get the information out to everybody else? I'm not quite sure, to be perfectly honest. I wonder sometimes in my skepticism if maybe they might get like a higher order or ranking if they help so many people find Jehovah. I'm not quite sure. That's completely my guess. I could be way off the mark on that. It's just my guess. So let me tell you about what that space looks like. So a Jehovah Witness worship space, it's called a Kingdom Hall. They don't say they have worship services. They don't have services in general. They call them meetings. They call them town meetings. So it'll look like a normal business on the outside. It does not have much signage, again, because typically the Jehovah Witness organization isn't thought of in positive lights by many people. Some people think of it in rather negative connotations. So they don't have a ton of signage typically. And when people come to town meetings, they typically do not arrive all at once. They'll arrive in little groups and little spurts. They don't like big congregations meeting at one time and coming in. That's just what they do. Now, when you get inside, they're very warm and welcoming people inside. They'll talk to you. They won't typically talk to you in the parking lot. I'm not quite sure why, but they won't. So when you get inside, you'll be struck with two things. First of all, you'll notice that there's minimal to no windows. And second, you'll notice that there's not much of anything as far as decor. There's folding chairs typically set up, and there might be like a podium where somebody is speaking, but that's about it. There's no crosses, no flowers, no piano, no nothing like that. It's a rather blank space. So that's the worship space itself. Now, when worship starts, it typically starts with songs, and in the church that I was a part of, they were very big on music, so I knew quite a lot of the music. I knew none of the songs at a Jehovah Witness Kingdom Hall meeting. None. And I learned that the reason I didn't know any of the songs is because they have their own songs. And you won't know the songs unless you're a Jehovah Witness. It's in English, but I didn't know any of the songs. So they sing for a while. Some people raised their hands and like prayed like that. Some people didn't. It just was songs. It just was new songs to me. After the songs were done, there was a leader. It wasn't a pastor or a priest or anything like that. It was just a leader. It was one of the people in the congregation that got up, and it wasn't a service. It wasn't like he was preaching. It basically was an hour-long Bible study where all the people who were at service got out their Bibles. We didn't bring any because we didn't know about that part, but they got out their Bibles and they were making notes and they were highlighting and they were having this discussion and talking about the Bible. Okay, great. Kind of overwhelming because they were talking about their point of view and they didn't necessarily want to consider other points of view. It was just their point of view. Out of respect, we didn't raise our hand or say anything. We just were listening. And then after the Bible study, they had another hour-long talk, debate, whatever you want to call it. But this time it was about the Watchtower. The Watchtower is that magazine or booklet or whatever you want to call it that they bring around when they come to your house. And basically what they were doing is they were going through certain articles and they were told every week they were given a new Watchtower booklet and they were told to study it and they had to answer specific questions and in a specific way. So basically they were kind of quizzing each other. And a lot of what was happening during that time is they were working on their public speaking skills. Jehovah Witnesses, in my experience, have phenomenal public speaking skills Because if you're going out into the community and you're trying to get people to see the importance of Jehovah, you would want to have good public speaking skills. Otherwise, they're not going to understand you and you're going to get frustrated. So, phenomenal public speaking skills. After they had their debate, study, whatever you want to call it, about the Watchtower, then worship ended. And sometimes they said they had cookies or juice. This time they didn't. Another thing that was interesting about the Jehovah Witness people were when they explained to us that they don't celebrate holidays. So in the Christian church, they have like Pentecost and they have Easter and they have Lent and all these different things. Jehovah Witnesses celebrate the death of Jesus, not the birth, the death, not the resurrection, not Easter, just the death. And they celebrate anniversaries. That's it. That's it. Now, they'll only celebrate your anniversary if you marry another Jehovah Witness. Occasionally, they will celebrate birthdays as well. But they only focus on the death of Jesus and anniversaries. Occasionally, birthdays. So that was very intriguing to the students, and they were immediately turned off, quite honestly, from Jehovah Witness because they liked getting presents on all the other holidays. So that was where they were for that one. It was interesting when we had conversations with the Jehovah Witness leaders because they just focused, they helped drive home that their main focus is on Jehovah. There's one God, and what he can do is uncomparable to anybody else. Who they are, where they're going, stuff like that, the stuff in the here and the now didn't matter. They were focused on Jehovah. And that's all they cared about, was just Jehovah. I know, it was very interesting. The kids left that experience and had tons of questions. Their eyes were open to experience that their parents never did. Now, one caveat that we had to tell the parents, because the Jehovah Witnesses are known to be very friendly and kind of pushers a little bit because they come to your house, we had prepped the kids as well as the families that they would likely be asked their names, and they were only to give their first name. They were not allowed to give their last name on anything, and they were not allowed to write their name on anything. So like a guest book or things like that, because we didn't want to have them pressured. We wanted to shield them a little bit from feeling like they needed to explain themselves to somebody else. So we just decided that they would give only their first name, and if a name needed to be written down, it was only my name. So that's what we did for the Jehovah Witness experience. It was a great experience. After we went to the Jehovah Witness Kingdom Hall, unfortunately, the local chapter merged with a different chapter, and they moved farther away. That was no longer able to accommodate our visits, but it was a good experience and one that I would do again with kids, just to have them have that experience. It was great. Okay, we're getting there, I promise. As of right now, we're about halfway. But all the churches that we're going to talk about next are similar in many ways. So all of the churches that are to come that we're talking about next are all falling within what's called the Protestant movement. So typically it's Catholic and Protestant. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what makes that difference. So Protestants believe in God, they believe in Jesus, they believe in the Bible. Now, there are many, many different Protestant church splits, and all those splits happen based on how they view God, how they view Jesus, how they view the Bible. Is Jesus God's son? Is Jesus God incarnate? Like, Is the Bible literally understood? Is the Bible just a guide? Is the Bible the Word of God? Is the Bible not? That's how all the different splits happen in the Protestant side of things. And so the first section that we're going to talk about is actually the Lutheran movement. So we went to a Lutheran church. The church that we went to was a Missouri Synod. There are two different synods or branches within Lutheranism. Lutheranism, I think that's the right way to say it. So there's Wisconsin and there's Missouri. Of the two, they have similarities, but they also have differences. The Wisconsin movement is known to be the stricter of the two. And because I'm from Wisconsin, I happen to know that the Wisconsin movement started or originated in Milwaukee. So that's something that they can encourage, celebrate, whatever you want to see it. The Missouri Synod is more relaxed, but the big split between the two synods is in regard to how they view women or their role within the church. So, the Wisconsin Synod is very strict. So they view that women should not have any role of authority and they shouldn't have any leadership role, period. So, for example, I was coming to that church as a confirmation teacher. In the Lutheran church, I could only be a confirmation teacher if there were no males available and no males interested. That's where I could be a confirmation teacher. Otherwise, not going to happen. In the Missouri Synod, I could have many more roles, but I could never have a leadership role. So I could do perhaps custodial work. I could work in an office as like a secretary, but I couldn't be like the head of a congregation. I couldn't be a preaching pastor, things like that. The role of women is viewed differently in the Lutheran church. They view the man as the head of the household, and women are rather subservient to that. The big thing about Lutherans that we learned when we were on the visits is they take the Bible very literally. They use the phrase is means is. So if the Bible says ABC, then it's ABC, and there's no variation from that. It's just very, very strict and very succinct. It's very traditional, similar to a Catholic church, but there are differences that also make it more similar to a United Church of Christ church, as far as they don't have a pope or things like that. They have a little bit of a hierarchy with the pastor being above the rest of the people, but there is a sense of community there. There's a big sense of tradition in the Lutheran movement. And they view themselves as the one true people because they are very literal. They view that if you do not believe just what they believe, then you're not getting to heaven, typically. It was an interesting experience. The kids saw many more similarities between the Lutheran Church and the United Church of Christ that we were a part of than they anticipated. They have hymnals just like we did. There were many songs that were similar. There were many prayers that were similar. There was another book in the pew that we weren't used to, and I believe it was an order of worship. They didn't have a bulletin for us to follow. They just kind of rolled with it. It wasn't presented or anything like that. Everybody else just knew what to do, so we followed along. And that's what the Lutheran church was like. The next church that we went to was rather similar to a Catholic church. It was called an Episcopal church. And that church was interesting because it didn't have any electricity. And we're in Wisconsin. So that church in particular only was open and had services during a couple of months out of the year. But it functioned very much like a Catholic church. There was holy water when you walked in. Instead of having the fold down kneelers, there were actually cushions that you put on the floor to kneel. It was presided over by, I believe he was called Father, which would indicate that he was a priest of some sort. But very traditional in their practices. There was some portions that were in Latin, just like in the Catholic Church. They believe tradition above all. So tradition is huge for them. It's not about how you interpret the Bible. It's this is tradition. This is what the preacher is saying. This is what we do. So that's how it makes it a little bit different than the Catholic Church, but very, very similar. The next one that we went to is actually similar to the Episcopal Church. It was called the Methodist Church. So Methodist Church was very similar, probably the most similar to the United Church of Christ Church that we were a part of. The hymnals were the same or very similar, maybe a slight word or two different. The difference between a Methodist church and an Episcopal church is Episcopal was all about tradition. Methodist church was all about your personal experience and having that communication with others and learning from each other. So that was different. It was more of a community where we were learning from each other. There wasn't any kneeling in the Methodist church, a lot of singing, and a big sense of community. There were people I've never met before, and they invited us in to come and eat with them, and they were having a great old time. Now it was extra special for me personally because the day that we happened to go to worship there, it was actually led by my aunt and my uncle. But that was the Methodist Church. It was very similar to the United Church of Christ church that we were a part of. Lots of singing, lots of beautiful stained glass windows. Of course, there were pews, there was a pulpit, there was lots of items like a cross and an altar and things like that. But it wasn't as much focused on the things, it was focused on the people. It was all about the community. So that was the Methodist Church. Okay, hold on with me. There are a total of 3 more that we're going to go over. So the next one that I want to talk about was, quite honestly, the one that scared me. It was the Greek Orthodox Church. So the Greek Orthodox Church, many people think it's a Catholic church, but it is actually a Protestant church because they don't view the Pope as an authority figure. So if you take the Pope out of it, then it's typically not a Catholic church. They're focused on not the Pope. The Pope doesn't have authority. So they are viewed as a Protestant church. Okay? Let me tell you why it was scarring and kind of scary to me. It was a big building and it was very dark. All the windows were dark. Almost looked from the outside that they were boarded up or filtered in some way. And it just looked very Gothic in appearance. And so it kind of gave the illusion that you were not supposed to be there. You were supposed to stay away. Okay? So when we walked in, big, huge, heavy wooden doors. Initially, they were locked. We knocked a couple of times. They let us in finally. We were allowed to enter the building. Then we had to wait there again until someone would come and get us to enter into the actual building. We kind of stayed in this little alcove part. And that was scary, quite honestly. Everyone that was there was really dressed to the nines. It was suits and ties and dresses and they were dressed very modestly but very upscale. There was a preacher there. He went by Father, and he was wearing a hat. They don't all wear hats, but he was. in talking to a person that I used to work with that was Greek Orthodox, because the people, when we went to the worship visit, wanted nothing to do with talking to us. We got side eyes like, why are you here? And there was just a general feeling of, you're not supposed to be here. So I asked most of my questions from the kids and myself after the fact to the person that I happened to know. So he explained that in the Greek Orthodox Church, tradition is very important. They do things because this is the way they've always done them. And that's what they feel they're supposed to do. So let me walk you through what a service was like, okay? I already told you it was dark. There was no cushions on the pews or anything. All the music was sung very melancholy. It wasn't joyful. It wasn't exciting. There wasn't beautiful, ornate decor about the sanctuary. It was somber in mood. And they were there for a purpose, and they didn't want anything to distract them from their purpose, is kind of how it felt. That might be very well be wrong, but that's how it felt to me. Now, I also wanted to share with you about, during service, there was a lot of talk about the mystery of God, and there was a lot of incense to kind of build that mystery in the room. It was just interesting to hear them talk and hear the way they were interpreting scriptures. Now, when I talked to the person I knew that happened to be Greek Orthodox afterwards, they also explained to me that, so in Protestant cultures, typically they believe in a triune. So Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit, they work together, and they can kind of be used interchangeably to do different things. In the Greek Orthodox Church, they don't believe that. They believe God is God, the one true God, there is nobody with him. But they believe that the Holy Spirit and Jesus can do things on his behalf, essentially. He does not get any power from them. He does not need them, but he can use the Holy Spirit and Jesus to do things on his behalf. That's how the Greek Orthodox view it. That was a scary one for me. I felt very much like I was not welcomed there, and I was very protective of the students, and I didn't want to have them in a situation where they were not welcomed. And yeah, so we left that place quickly, and we debriefed on the way home and at the United Church of Christ when we got there. It was an interesting one. We went to that church once, and we did not go back because, yeah, it just was not the best fit for me, and I didn't feel it was safe for them to go. So the next church we went to was a Baptist church, and in my little small town, we actually happened to have a Baptist church. And surprisingly, this was one of the churches that the kids really liked. It was very similar to the United Church of Christ in many ways again. But the Baptist church they liked because it was all about a personal experience. The Baptist church is very much about mission work. So going out, spreading the news, doing things, not just sitting and getting and giving money and doing these things. They're all about taking an active step of faith and doing that. In so much as every Baptist church has its own things that they support, and the Baptist churches in general are not linked together. Every church stands alone, and every member of that church stands alone. They do what they view is best. There were some things that were very unifying, however, in the Baptist church. So in the Baptist church, as you would imagine, baptism is very important to them. Baptism will happen multiple times throughout their life. It's typically whenever there is something big or a new level of understanding is obtained. then they will do a baptism. And the Baptist church do a full immersion baptism. So the pastor that was at the church that we visited actually showed us behind their altar area, there was this board that they lifted up, and in the ground there was like a tub. You took a couple steps in, and then it was this tub that you would stand in, and the pastor would take you and do a full body submersion, and then when you came up, you were baptized with Christ and a new person in Christ. So they will do baptisms whenever, wherever. As the Baptist church, they don't have a set age that you have to be to accept Christ and receive your first baptism. They don't do baptisms as a baby because they want you to be able to express your commitment and connection to God and Jesus. So they said that they've had people as young as 4 do baptism, and you can be baptized umpteen times when you have new understandings, when you have something big happen in your life, things like that. The service itself was very similar to a service at the United Church of Christ. Most of the songs were the same. Most of the scripture passages were the same. The one interesting thing I will share about the songs is they had a piano. It was a baby grand piano, and it was beautiful, and there was somebody who played it beautifully. But there was a music director that literally, when it was singing in the service, he would stand up and he would like conduct the congregation. And I was surprised by that. I've never experienced that before unless I was in a choir. So I was just surprised to see the music director actually stand up and physically conduct the congregation in song. That was intriguing to me. It was very intriguing. So service started, lots of songs, the prayers all same. They do not receive offering during service. They did that at a later time, but they always had what the offering was going to. They mentioned that in the bulletin. It was like a paper thing that they received to us. And typically it was going towards a mission. Now I don't know if the whole offering went to the mission. I don't know if the church kept a portion of it for their building maintenance. I'm not certain, but that was service. And the pastor was very open to questions afterwards. He was very welcoming, and the people in the service in general were very welcoming. They were very modestly dressed, and that was something that we prepped for before we went to service. So for a female, for example, they had to wear either a skirt or a dress. It was non-negotiable. And they had to be covered from their collarbone to at least their elbow, and their dress or skirt had to go down past their knees. You could wear pants or leggings or whatever underneath, but you needed to wear a skirt to show your feminineness and also be modest in there. Men wore pants of different styles and shirts, whether it's a polo or a button-down shirt or whatever. But the females definitely had to dress more modestly and be covered more. Something the pastor at the Baptist church did share that just helped us understand some of the similarities and differences is in service, they only use their hymnal music. But he also shared that while in the United Church of Christ, we have a hymnal, and then outside of church, we can listen to whatever music. The Baptist people do not. The Baptist will listen to only hymn music. Anything else, they don't view as appropriate, and they will not listen to it. They also don't do dancing. They believe that leads to thoughts of lust in the opposite gender, and that's not keeping their body holy. So they don't dance. They don't dance. They don't listen to music, or I should say they don't sing. I don't know that they would run screaming from like a Walmart if there's music playing, but they do not purposely try to have songs around them that are of the secular nature. The last one I want to share with you is another one of the students' favorites, and that was when we went to a non-denominational church. Now, I have to do a caveat and share with you that most non-denominational churches are basically Baptist churches with a slight twist. They are typically all focused about you and your experiences, not focused on the church or on tradition. Many non-denominational churches will do full body immersion baptisms, but they are all about knowing and accepting the fact that we're not perfect. So in every single non-denominational church that we visited, they purposely had like the walls painted but not finished. The lettering would be askewed to remind the people who are coming to worship that they are not perfect, they are not finished, they are a work in process or a work in progress, and that God is still working in them. So it was very, very interesting. The kids loved the relaxed nature. They loved the idea that they didn't have to be perfect and they could still be changing and they could still be loved. They also loved, now this was just them being teenagers, but they loved the fact that there was food aplenty. There was coffee offered to them on the way in to service, and they had donuts and breakfast sandwiches and pancakes and all kinds of stuff, and they were encouraged to bring it into the worship space. Now, when they went into the worship space, it did not look like a standard church. It had couches and it had little bistro tables and chairs, and there was a stage with a band set up, and there was a projection screen with music videos playing, and it typically had kind of like warehouse vibes, but the lights were off, and it might have some spotlights or Christmas lights, and they loved the fact that there were lazy boys to sit in, and there was a whole play area in the back for the kids. They had toys there that the kids could play on and lay on and do different things. Now, the one part they didn't like about the service was it was long. And by long, I mean it was 2 hours. 2 hours of service. And then we happened to leave early. It lasted for another hour and a half after we left. But we had told the parents that it would be an hour, hour and a half, and we needed to get them back home. So 2 hours of service. It was long. The kids enjoyed it, but that attention span was not there for 2 hours worth of service. So all the different worship visits that we experienced were great, and they offered so many different insights. There were things that the kids found similar amongst all of them. There was, in every single place we went, something that indicated that God was in that space. So whether it was a red light, or they lit a candle, or it was incense, it was something in every space to remind those that were gathered that God was in that space. That was the biggest thing. Every place we went to had different views on who Jesus was and how he fit in, the Bible and what that was. It had different views as to how you were supposed to interact with each other and God, and it was a great experience. I loved it for the students, and I loved it for myself, because if you don't get outside of your little box, you don't know what you don't know. And I wouldn't change that for anything in the world. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this long video about all the different worship spaces, and I hope you continue to question things in your life and step outside your box every once in a while so you can experience something new. Because that's what you're here for doing. Okay? Sounds great. I will see you next time. Until then, take care.